The day I decided to finally delete the message, I was sitting alone in my apartment with my finger hovering over the delete button for what felt like an eternity. 12 years. That's how long I had kept that answering machine. That's how long I had preserved that single moment in time. A voice saying one word, "Hi," like he was just about to tell me something important, like he was about to change everything. But he never got the chance, and I never had the courage to let him go. His name was James. I was 28 years old when I met him, and he was the kind of man who made you believe in things you'd stopped believing in a long time ago. He made you believe in second chances. He made you believe that love could fix things that were fundamentally broken inside of you. He made you believe that someone could see all the dark parts of your soul and choose to stay anyway. For 2 years, I believed in all of that. And then one Tuesday morning in March, he didn't show up at the coffee shop where we always met before work. I called his apartment. No answer. I called his office. His co-workers said he hadn't come in. I called the hospitals. I called his family. I called the police. Nobody knew where James was. It was like he had simply evaporated from the world, leaving behind only the ghost of his voice on my answering machine, which I had saved the message from 2 weeks before he disappeared. He had called me while I was in a meeting and he left that message. Just one word. Like he was surprised I wasn't home. Like he expected me to be there, waiting for him. "Hi," he said on the recording. That was it. That was everything he left me. 3 days later, they found his body in the river. They said it looked like he had been there for about a week. They said it appeared to be suicide, though they couldn't be entirely sure because of the state of decomposition. They said I should prepare myself for a closed casket funeral. They said a lot of things that I don't remember, because the only thing I could focus on was the fact that I had that message. I had his voice. I had those 2 seconds of his existence preserved on magnetic tape, and as long as I didn't delete it, he wasn't entirely gone. I didn't go to the funeral. I couldn't. I was too busy sitting in my apartment with that answering machine, playing the message over and over again. "Hi, hi, hi." Like maybe if I heard it enough times, I could figure out what he had been about to say. Like maybe I could decode some hidden meaning in that single syllable that would explain why he had decided to end his life. Like maybe there was something I had missed, some clue that would have saved him if I had just been paying attention. My therapist at the time, and yes, I had a therapist because I was falling apart in ways that were impossible to hide, told me that I was obsessing over the message as a way of avoiding the reality of his death. She told me that I needed to accept that he was gone, and that holding on to his voice was just a way of refusing to move forward. She told me that I needed to let him go, but she didn't understand. She didn't understand that as long as that message was there, James wasn't entirely dead. He was suspended in time. He was caught in that moment right before he was about to say something. He was eternal in his incompleteness. I kept the answering machine through 3 moves. I kept it through the technological revolution that made answering machines obsolete. I kept it through relationships with other men who asked me why I still had that ancient piece of machinery sitting on my kitchen counter. I kept it through my 30s, through my 40s, through all the years that accumulated between me and that moment when I was 28 years old and devastatingly in love with a man who couldn't stay. I never played the message in front of anyone. It was my private ritual. It was my secret. It was the one thing in my life that belonged only to me and to the ghost of James. But about 6 months ago, something shifted inside of me. I was 40 years old, and I realized that I had spent more than half of my adult life holding on to a dead man's voice. I had spent more than half of my adult life frozen in that moment of grief, unable to move forward because I was too busy looking backward. I had built an entire life around the absence of him, a life of careful choices and measured emotions and calculated distances because I was so afraid of loving someone else the way I had loved James, only to have them leave me again. I had never gotten married. I had never had children. I had never let anyone get close enough to hurt me the way he had hurt me. I had been living, but I hadn't been living. I had been existing in suspended animation, just like James's voice on that answering machine. So I took the machine out of the drawer where I had been keeping it. I hadn't even looked at it in years. I had moved past the phase of playing the message obsessively. But I also hadn't gotten rid of it. I couldn't get rid of it. Even as time passed and I became someone new, even as I built a life that looked relatively normal and functional on the surface, I couldn't bring myself to delete that message. I sat down on my kitchen floor with the machine in my hands and I looked at it. It was so small, so insignificant, but it held everything. It held the last moment I had with James. It held the last echo of his existence. It held the moment right before the end. I pressed play. "Hi," he said, and I started to cry. Not the desperate, anguished tears I had cried for years after he died. These were different tears. These were sad, but they were also something else. They were the tears of someone who was finally allowing herself to acknowledge that holding on to him had meant giving up on herself. I looked at that message, and for the first time in 12 years, I understood something. I understood that James hadn't left me the message as a gift. He hadn't left it as a way to stay connected to me. He had left it as an accident. He had called me when I wasn't home, and he had left a message, and then 2 weeks later, he had made a choice that ended his life. That message wasn't a treasure, it was evidence. It was a symptom of the pain he was in, the pain that I had never been able to fix or cure or even fully understand. By holding on to that voice, by preserving it like some kind of sacred relic, I wasn't honoring James. I was honoring his death. I was honoring his pain. I was choosing to freeze myself in the moment of his greatest suffering, and I was calling it love. I thought about all the things I had given up because I was so afraid of being left again. I thought about the man I had dated in my 30s who had asked me to move to California with him. And I had said no because I was too terrified of losing him the way I had lost James. I thought about the women I could have been friends with if I had let myself be vulnerable enough to form real connections. I thought about the versions of myself that I had killed off preemptively, just so that no one would ever have the power to hurt me the way James had. And I realized that by refusing to let him go, I had actually killed myself. I had killed the version of me that was willing to take risks, that was willing to love without a guarantee of forever, that was willing to live in the present instead of being haunted by the past. So I sat there on that kitchen floor, holding that old answering machine, and I made a decision. I decided that I was going to let him go, but I wasn't going to do it quietly. I wasn't going to do it while I was alone. I was going to do it consciously, intentionally, and with full awareness of what it meant. I called my best friend Sarah. I told her what I had been holding on to for 12 years. I told her about the message and the answering machine and the way that James's voice had become like a talisman, that I used to remind myself that I was capable of suffering, which somehow felt like proof that I was capable of loving. Sarah came over. She brought wine and chocolate and a lot of patience, and together we sat on my kitchen floor, and I played the message one last time. "Hi," James said. And Sarah reached over and held my hand, and she didn't say anything. She just sat with me in that moment. And then, when I was ready, I pressed the delete button. The message disappeared. The screen went blank. James was gone. I pressed delete, and the world didn't end. For 12 years, I'd preserved that one voicemail like a sacred relic. "Hi." Just one word from James, left 2 hours before he ended his life. I'd built a shrine around that single syllable, convinced it held some profound meaning I was meant to decipher. But when my finger finally hovered over the delete button, I didn't feel devastation. I felt lighter, like I'd been carrying something so heavy for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to move without that weight crushing me. My friend Sarah watched me, her eyes soft with understanding. "Do you want to tell me about him?" she asked gently. "The real James, not the ghost version. The man you actually loved." And I realized with a jolt that I couldn't. I had spent over a decade immortalizing James as a symbol of perfect love and tragic loss, that I had completely erased the actual person. The real James had bad jokes that weren't funny. He got frustrated in traffic. He was messy, leaving clothes on the floor. He struggled with depression in ways I never fully understood, no matter how hard I tried to reach him. By transforming him into a saint, I had killed him twice, first in reality, then in my memory. I had replaced the complex, flawed man I loved with an idealized version that became the reason I refused to live my own life. "Tell me about the real things," Sarah prompted again. So I did. I told her about the time he got food poisoning and spent the night on the bathroom floor, too embarrassed to see me for days afterward. I confessed how he hated his job, but never took steps to change it. I remembered how he'd fall asleep during movies, how he snored, how he was terrible with money. And I finally admitted what I'd never voiced aloud, that I knew he was depressed, and I had foolishly believed my love could cure him. "Do you think you could have saved him?" Sarah asked. The truth washed over me like cold water. "No," I said, and for the first time in 12 years I meant it. I had spent so long asking what I could have done differently that I had centered myself in his tragedy. By blaming myself for his death, I had actually made his suffering about my pain instead of his. That night I did something I hadn't done since he died. I looked at our old photographs without crying. I studied his eyes, searching for the pain he must have been carrying. And I cried tears that were different from all the others. These weren't for what I had lost, but for what he must have endured. For the darkness that made him feel death was his only escape. Over the following weeks I started therapy, and actually dealt with my grief instead of just carrying it. I acknowledged that loving someone doesn't give you the power to save them from themselves. I began saying yes to things that scared me, including a date with a coworker named David. He was nothing like James, steady where James was stormy, reliable where James was unpredictable. He didn't make me feel like I was in some beautiful tragedy. He made me feel safe. We didn't last forever, but that relationship taught me I could be vulnerable without it destroying me. Love didn't have to be tragic to be real. Then, 6 months ago in a grocery store, everything changed again. I saw James's sister for the first time in years. We had lost touch after the funeral, the grief between us too heavy to bridge. But she hugged me and said words I never expected to hear. "I've always wanted to thank you for being there for James. You made him happy, and that meant something." I cried right there between the produce and dairy sections. For 12 years I had carried his death as my failure. But his sister was telling me I had done something right. I had made him happy. That was enough. That was all I could have done. We started meeting for coffee, and she reminded me of James in ways I had forgotten. His laugh, his generosity, the way he could light up a room. She didn't erase the tragedy, but she put it in context. James had been a person who struggled, yes, but he had also been a person who loved and was loved. His death didn't erase any of that. A few months later, I decided to volunteer at a suicide prevention hotline. It wasn't about saving other people, because I couldn't save James. It was about channeling my pain into something productive. It was about acknowledging that depression is real and serious, and people struggling need compassion and hope. I started taking calls from people in their darkest moments, people who couldn't see a way out. And I just listened. I held space for their pain. Through that work, I realized James had been one of those voices. He had been someone with a whole internal world that had become too dark to navigate. I'm 42 now. I've built a life I actually enjoy. Traveling, reading, spending time with friends. I volunteer. I've become someone I like being. The answering machine is long gone. I don't need to preserve his voice to know he existed. I don't need that single word to remember we loved each other. That was real. It happened. And it shaped me into who I am today. But it doesn't define me anymore. Sometimes I still hear that high in my mind. But now I hear possibility instead of tragedy. I hear the beginning of a conversation that never happened, all the ways our story might have continued. And I let that version of him go too, with love, gratitude, and the understanding that some people come into our lives not to stay forever, but to teach us something essential about who we are and what we can endure. James taught me I was strong enough to survive loss. He taught me that love isn't always enough to fix things. And he taught me that holding on to the past is a way of dying along with the person we've lost. So I chose to live. Finally, after 12 years, I chose to really live. And it's the best decision I've ever made.